Once upon a time, there was a land that was happy and prosperous. It had a great education system, safe streets, and jobs for everyone. There were a few poor people and a few rich people. Most were in the middle. The people of this land paid for their good life by investing in their future together. They called this paying taxes.
Yeah, if you've seen how the government spends its money and how much debt it racks up on a daily basis, you'd understand why saying that paying taxes is an investment for the future is a bit of a heavy lift.
Everyone paid what they could afford.
Yeah, the way the current system works now is you pay based on what you can afford and not on what government services you use. This type of system has not only moral but practical issues with it, as I'll get into later.
The poor people paid a little, the people in the middle paid a middling amount, and the rich people, 1% of everyone, paid more than the others.
But gets access to the same exact government services as everyone else.
Just about everyone thought that this was best.
Is it though? I mean, you have everybody paying different amounts but for the same exact services. So you'll have people who can't afford to pay as much piggybacking off of the people who can. Putting the morality and fairness of it aside for the time being, from a market economic perspective, is this really the best way of doing this?
But over time, rich people decided they weren't rich enough.
Well, first let's start with the assumption that it's primarily the wealthy who are against high taxes. A higher tax rate primarily affects actually the middle and lower classes. This is because of what's known as the law of diminishing marginal utility, which is basically a fancy economic way of saying the more money you have, the less additional money you need. In fact, the rich usually like higher tax rates. Because of the before-mentioned law of diminishing marginal utility, the extra amount they pay in taxes is worth less than the advantage they get by pushing other people out of the market. But let's assume for the time being that yes, it is primarily the wealthy who are aggrieved about taxes. The underlying rationale for their grievance would more likely be due to morality and economics rather than they simply just want more wealth.
So they came up with ways to get richer. The first way was through tax cuts. They didn't mind if this meant fewer services for everyone.
Well, not necessarily. The government would just have to find some other way to come up with the funding for those services. Or perhaps find more efficient ways of operating those services such that they can provide the same level of service at the lower budget. It's not a false dichotomy between the rich getting to keep more of their money and there being less government services around.
They said, why should I care about other non-rich people?
Actually, that's a good question. Why does having more wealth all of a sudden obligate me toward those who don't have as much?
I can hire teachers, safety, waste disposal people to work for me for less money than taxes cost.
Well, yes, that's true, because in that case you're paying directly for the services that you use and not for a bloated government bureaucracy.
And then I can keep the rest of my taxes for me.
What exactly is the problem here? He's simply opting to use a service that's able to provide him the same quality but at less of a cost. That's a good thing. Why should the burden be on the rich people to pay extra for services they can get for cheaper somewhere else? Shouldn't the burden be on government to provide a better quality service or provide it more efficiently so that more people use the government service? You're blaming rich people because government can't compete in the free market.
The second way rich people got richer was through tax loopholes. These are laws that allow people to avoid paying taxes, with the idea that it's beneficial for other people too, if this group didn't pay.
Well, the more money the rich people get to keep, the more of it they get to reinvest in their company and grow their businesses. This results in jobs and opportunities for other people too. So yes, it is beneficial for everybody when the rich get to keep their money.
The third way rich people got richer was to pay no taxes at all. This is called tax evasion. Of course, if all the people did this, everything would fall apart.
Well, not really. Most likely what would be the case if nobody was paying government for these services, they would be opting toward private sector options to get these services, in the free market. This gets back to that point that I made earlier. Just because we aren't funding these services a specific way doesn't mean they're not being funded, period.
But rich people and giant companies they owned figured no one would notice. This is illegal, but many did it anyway.
Well, yes, tax evasion is rather easy to get away with. But do you know why that is? It's because the current system makes it easy. You see, one of the reasons that it's really stupid to charge people based on how much income they earn is because it's rather difficult to prove. The other reason is the government's model of doing business is also kind of stupid. They just hand out their services to the public and just kind of expect them to pay. Or let me put it this way. Why aren't there issues with electricity bill evasion or water bill evasion? Because the electricity company, A, charges you based on what you use, not what you earn, so it's much more easy to prove how much you owe, and B, they secure the payment, then provide the service. So yes, while it is rather easy to get away with tax evasion, that's because the government's doing a shitty job at gatekeeping its services from those who don't pay.
And so it went. In 20 years, rich people doubled their share of the land's income.
Yes, it's true that the amount of money that the wealthy have has increased drastically over the years, but that has very little, if anything, to do with taxes. This is largely due to the fact that the economy has grown stronger over the years thanks to innovation and free market capitalism. But the same goes for a lot of other economic classes too. It's not just the wealthy who've increased their wealth over the years thanks to these innovations and stronger economy.
Schools, public safety, the roads, parks, libraries, public transportation all went into decline.
Yeah, but can you really blame rich people for that? I mean, even with all the tax cuts, the budget for these public services still numbers in the millions and billions. Is it rich people, or is it the fact that there's very little incentive to ensure the quality of the service you're providing when your patronage is coerced?
The rich people didn't care. They said everyone gets what they deserve, and they bought their own teachers, police, garbage collectors, and transportation.
Yeah, how dare they not want to pay for government services they don't use? And if these private alternatives are so much better and cheaper than the government ones that the rich people are willing to use it, well, why doesn't everyone else just use those same services too? Another thing this cartoon conveniently leaves out is the other private companies providing these same services competing alongside that one. The private sector isn't a monolith. It's not the government versus the entire private sector. This is yet again another false dichotomy. That's like what, the fifth one in this video?
They also bought something else, elections. They spent so much money on politics, they elected people who liked what they liked.
Huh. It's almost as if, when you're forced to pay a certain entity whether you want to or not, there's no way to hold them responsible for their corruption.
More tax cuts for the rich and big businesses, and fewer schools, road repairs, police, firefighters, and nurses for everyone else.
But didn't you admit in this very video not too long ago that there are private sector alternatives to government services?
When the 99% became upset, the rich people and their politicians said, "There is no other way." They repeated this so often many people believed them.
Well, free market capitalism is all about finding all the possible solutions to a given problem. It's usually the authoritarians who propose that there is only one single possible solution to every problem.
Meanwhile, instead of investing in things that most people could use, and instead of providing jobs that paid people well like they used to, rich people found they could make more money on Wall Street.
If it wasn't for government regulating the stock trade market, Wall Street would have more competition.
Wall Street is a place where money makes money. Here, the 1% made money so fast that they devoted more and more money to it.
Yeah, if there's anything that's been good for the little guy, it's been stock trading. Not only has this enabled companies to grow their capital, therefore invest and hire new people, but it also enabled the little guy to get in on the profit the big companies make. Regardless of how low in society you are, how dirt poor you are, you can get a slice of the profit that big companies make. That's how awesome stock trading is.
They took some of that money and sent it far away, where workers had no rights to produce things that workers used to produce here.
Again, I don't see what the problem is. People in that part of the world get more jobs, and therefore more opportunities, and people over here get cheaper prices on the goods that they buy. But hey, if you're so concerned about companies moving operations overseas to save money, maybe try cutting the regulations a bit.
When ordinary people wondered why rich people needed so much money, the 1% said, "Don't worry. This is good for you too, because it will trickle down from us to you." Someday you'll be rich, and then the rules we made for us will be your rules too.
So trickle-down economics is this whole idea that giving special treatment to rich people benefits everybody, because the benefits that the rich people get eventually trickle down, so to speak, to the lower classes. And as I have mentioned before, there is some truth to the fact that the more money rich people get to keep, the more they reinvest into the economy, and that benefits everybody. However, within the context in which trickle-down economics is usually mentioned, that is, government giving special treatment to rich people in the forms of, say, grants and subsidies that come from the lower class, this reasoning ultimately falls flat. And that's something this video fails to mention, that historically trickle-down economics has been applied within the context of bigger government power, not less.
Some people weren't so sure about this, so the rich people bought newspapers and TV and radio stations and internet companies and paid them to repeat over and over, "Someday you will be rich too. There is no alternative." Soon you could hear people saying, "There is no other way. Someday we'll be rich."
Oh, don't even start with that. Like the left never buys out and influences the media.
Meanwhile, the rich people's money piled higher and higher. But after a while, it was piled too high. One day, the money fell down with a big crash. It fell down right on the houses of millions of ordinary people. It broke their houses. Then more money towers fell down. They fell on ordinary people's jobs.
I'm assuming this is meant to be a metaphor for the financial crash that occurred in the mid-2000s that resulted in property value depreciation and job loss for millions. Another thing they're trying to blame the wealthy on that was actually caused by government.
This is terrible. Everyone was scared. How did this happen? The government said, "We have to fix this." They were so used to rich people being rich, they immediately started printing money and giving it to rich people.
Government doing that is actually what caused the financial crash to occur in the first place.
But they didn't give any to the ordinary people whose houses and jobs were broken by the crash. Those people said, "You gave the rich people money to replace their money that got lost in the crash. Why aren't you giving us any to fix our houses and our jobs? They got broken in the crash too." The government had no answer. Now the people got mad. Since they weren't sure who to be madder at, the government or rich people, they got mad at both.
That sentiment isn't too unreasonable since both are largely responsible. However, since rich people couldn't do nearly the damage they could without government, I feel they're ultimately responsible for a majority of it.
Rich people got worried. They thought if the people get mad enough at us, they might take some of our money.
In a libertarian society, no number of people, even a majority of the population, will be able to take anything of yours without your consent.
This really upset the rich people, because they loved their money more than anything in the whole world.
I love how the left likes to paint the rich in an inhumane and condescending manner. It's almost as if they're butthurt that they have more money than they do, but don't want to put in the effort to earn more, which, shocker, right?
So they devised a plan. They called it, "Look over there!"
I'm sorry, this straw man is so ridiculous, I can't help but to laugh.
Whenever people said, "How come you rich people are getting richer while all the rest of us are losing our houses, our jobs, and our schools?" the rich people pointed at someone else and said, "Look over there!" First they pointed at the people whose houses were broken and said, "Look over there! Poor people caused the crash. They built their houses in the wrong place. If they hadn't done that, the money wouldn't have fallen on them." But most people didn't believe them. So the rich people pointed at someone else this time, teachers. They said, "Look over there! Teachers have jobs and you don't. No one can ever fire them. And lots of teachers are bad. The schools are failing. Teachers are the reason. Bad teachers. Bad teachers."
It's true the schools are failing, but I don't think that really has much to do with bad teachers. Heck, I believe most teachers actually care about their students and want them to succeed. The reason schools are failing is largely due to outdated curriculums that focus more on propaganda than they do actually enlightening children and encouraging development. This is, again, something that's largely the fault of government.
Most people didn't believe this. They remembered the problem was the crash, not bad teachers.
Although one could argue that bad education could be at least partially to blame. Who knows, maybe the crash could have been prevented if people's understanding of economics was better.
The rich people realized it might be safer for them if someone else pointed their fingers. So they took some of their money, and even though it was just a little bit of their money, it was a lot of money since they had so much. They helped more people get elected.
So you believe that politicians are corrupt and easily influenced, but at the same time you somehow trust them to be able to spend other people's money or make decisions how other people's money ought to be spent?
These politicians pointed their fingers at police, firefighters, librarians, and other public employees. They said, "Look over there! These people are greedy. They have jobs and you don't. You don't have retirement plans and they do. They caused the crash."
Even from a leftist propaganda perspective, this doesn't make any sense. All those people work for the government and serve their interests, so why would it make any sense for the government to blame them or throw them under the bus?
Some people thought this might be true. They knew someone or something had caused the money to fall. Maybe it was the firefighters. But others remembered that firefighters helped them when their houses were on fire.
Most fire departments in the United States, and I'm sure a lot of other places in the world, are both staffed and funded completely voluntarily.
They also remembered it was the 1% who built the money towers that crashed on their houses and jobs. Some people even remembered those towers of money had replaced factories and jobs that people used to have.
Actually, regulations are largely to blame for that.
And those jobs used to have retirement plans, too. And the ordinary people remembered that the teachers and firefighters lived in their neighborhoods and shopped in the same stores and didn't seem to be the problem at all.
But these rich people you're trying to throw under the bus, didn't they also shop at those stores and live in those neighborhoods? Actually, come to think of it, isn't it possible that maybe some of these rich people in their spare time volunteered as firefighters or did other community service in their spare time? Yet another false dichotomy this video's trying to paint.
The people looked around. They saw too many students in their classrooms. They saw their roads filling with holes. They saw when they needed help, it took longer to arrive.
You know what would be a real simple solution to this problem? Privatization. Turn these services over to the free market. Because of competition and freedom of choice, each entity in the market trying to provide these services will be incentivized not only to provide them at the highest quality, but also the lowest possible price. So unlike the current system where government provides stuff and if they're doing a shitty job, you're just kind of out of luck, you'd have the freedom to choose another firm that you think would better provide these services.
People began to say maybe rich people have too much money now.
Or the government has too much authority. After all, you did admit that they're at least part of the problem as well.
And maybe our problems have something to do with the 1% not paying their fair share of taxes.
Well, what exactly is a fair share of taxes? Who gets to decide how much that is?
And also, maybe rich people should pay the same rate of taxes they used to when our land was prosperous and more people were better off.
As I've mentioned before, society is usually better off when the rich get to keep more of their money because they benefit from that reinvestment. The problems you're concerned about are mostly due to government.
The rich people heard these things and grew worried. They told their politicians to pass laws to prevent people from organizing, prevent people from voting, prevent people from having retirement plans.
So you realize that government is to blame for a lot of these problems, but you continue to not only blame the rich, but also trust government to solve these problems.
But now the people understood the problem. It was rich people who crashed the money onto their houses and jobs. It was the 1% who got politicians to cut their taxes.
Do you make at least $30,000 a year? Congratulations, you're in the 1% globally.
Until there wasn't enough for schools, safe streets, libraries, healthcare, and parks. And it was rich people blaming everyone but themselves.
Funny how you accuse the rich people of scapegoating when that's basically what you've been doing this entire video.
For what had happened. This is where we are now. And we have a question. Is there no alternative? Or can the people of this land do something to live happily ever after?
Why, yes. There is something that the people of this town can do in order to live happily ever after. Several things, as a matter of fact. To start, they can innovate. This means finding different possible solutions to a problem instead of picking one that you think will work and just sticking with it. This mindset of, in order to solve all these problems, we just need to tax the rich more. But the data shows that that hasn't really worked. So instead of focusing on that solution, let's brainstorm and try to find others. Second possible solution is privatization. The narrator of this video clearly understands that government is to blame for a lot of these problems. However, it doesn't make any sense to acknowledge that government is responsible for these problems and yet somehow trust them to also solve those same problems. Let's solve this problem the same way most problems throughout history have been solved, through the private sector. An entity that can just take your money and do business with you without your consent has very little incentive to provide a quality service or do so efficiently. Contrast this with private sector firms, which need your consent in order to do business with you. The advantage of this ought to be obvious. Firms will compete with each other to see who can get the most business. This will drive up the quality of the service while driving down the cost. And the final potential solution is what's called voluntary taxation. So there are some who will argue that even with a largely privatized system, that some public services still may be essential. I wouldn't necessarily disagree, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have to have coercive funding. Voluntary taxation works largely the same way the free market does, but this time instead of private sector firms competing with each other, you now have the government throwing their hat in the ring and competing with the private sector. So what would this look like? It would be similar to the situation proposed in this video, where the wealthy person was opting to use government services instead of the private sector services and thus not paying taxes into those services. The reason the rich person opted to do this is because the private sector was able to offer him a better deal than government could. However, the narrator's proposed solution was to force this rich person to pay for the public services he doesn't use, where a more logical and rational solution would be have the government step up their game and compete more. If we implement these three solutions, I guarantee you these problems will significantly go away. And that sums up my thoughts on this video. Thank you very much for watching. Agree or disagree, feel free to discuss in the comments. If you enjoyed this video and like to see similar content, please subscribe. You can also support me on Patreon /Philosophossum. This has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.